As the Saurian High Council futilely begged the galaxies to save them from oblivion, only the carnivorous humans dared to respond to extinction's dinner bell. The hoots and bellows of the Saurian High Council echoed through the marbled council chambers as SK-1138's trajectory flashed across the projection screens. The space rock hurtled towards the heart of the binary star system, ready to smash the fertile amphibious homeworld. Uko, the youngblood initiate, watched as the ancient Saurian leaders shouted down each other's shallow hopes and pitiful plans for survival. At barely 70 cycles old, his mottled scales still glimmered with youthful luster as he absorbed every detail of the world-ending revelation. "The Arcturians have ignored our hails," Councillor Vass bellowed as he slapped his webbed claw on the carved hardwood debate table. "Those tentacled cowards!" "What of the Zorgons?" Councillor Hack croaked, perhaps for enough credits. "The Zorgons! Those swindling swine! They will rob us blind, then leave us for that rock to pulverize." Vass locked eyes with Uko across the panicked room. "Initiate, what news have you?" Uko's frills shivered involuntarily as he swallowed a thick lump of terror in his scaly throat. "Most exalted elders, I have the response from the final galactic power we petitioned." The chamber hissed with anticipation. "Who?" Vass growled. "The humans." The council chamber erupted in howling laughter. "Those minuscule mammals, those pathetic primates," Hack scoffed. "All we can do now is prepare for the end, for extinction. To lay down and await our species' inevitable destruction," Vass began. A heavy, hissing clang resounded as the council chamber's enormous hardwood doors pounded open. An alien figure, massive, fleshy, and scaleless, with a single glowing mechanical eye piercing from his rugged face, lumbered in with long strides. "Ralph Ramos, captain of the TSS Valiant. And I'm here to stop you slimy skinbags from getting snuffed by some glorified space pebble." Ramos fixed his mechanical eye on Uko, scanning the young Saurian for signs of fear or hesitation. But the amphibian met his gaze with a determined stare, his frills flaring with resolve. Ramos nodded, impressed by the youngling's spirit. "Listen up, kid," Ramos said, his voice low and gruff. "I've seen the tech your people have. It's not going to cut it against that rock. We need more firepower, and we need it fast." Uko's eyes widened. "But what can we do? The Council—" "The Council can't help us now. I'm going to call in some favors from my people, see if we can get some backup. In the meantime, I need you to round up any Saurians who are willing to fight. We're going to have to take matters into our own hands." Uko hesitated for a moment, then nodded firmly. "I understand. I'll gather the volunteers." As Uko scurried off, Ramos activated his communicator and hailed Terran Space Navy headquarters. He outlined the situation, emphasizing the urgency and the need for additional resources. But the response was not what he had hoped for. "I'm sorry, Captain Ramos," the Admiral said, his holographic face flickering with static. "But the Saurians are not a priority. We can't spare the resources or the personnel. You'll have to make do with what you have." He turned to see Uko returning, a group of Saurian volunteers trailing behind him. They were a motley crew, ranging from grizzled veterans to wide-eyed youngsters, but they all had one thing in common, a fierce determination to save their planet. Ramos grinned, his scarred face twisting into a predatory smile. "All right, you scaly bastards, let's get to work." Over the next few days, Ramos put the Saurians through a grueling training regimen. He taught them how to use human weapons, from plasma rifles to sonic grenades. He drilled them in tactics and strategy, showing them how to use their unique physiology to their advantage. "Your skin secretes a potent neurotoxin," he said, holding up a vial of clear liquid. "One drop of this can paralyze a human for hours. Use it wisely." As the training progressed, Ramos found himself growing closer to Uko. The young Saurian was a quick learner, absorbing everything Ramos taught him like a sponge. Ramos saw a bit of himself in the kid, a fierce determination to protect his people no matter the cost. But their activities did not go unnoticed. Councillor Zahn, a tall, scarred Saurian with a missing eye, had been watching Ramos with growing suspicion. He feared that the humans were using the asteroid crisis as a pretext to establish a foothold on their planet and exploit its resources. Zahn began to gather evidence of Ramos's activities, using his network of spies and informants to track the humans' every move. He planned to expose Ramos to the rest of the Council and have him expelled from the planet. As tensions rose between Ramos and Zahn, the asteroid continued its inexorable approach. It loomed ever larger in the sky, casting an ominous shadow over the planet and its inhabitants. Time was running out, and the fate of the Saurians hung in the balance. As the asteroid loomed ever closer, an eerie stillness settled over the Saurian homeworld. The streets, once bustling with activity, now lay deserted and silent. Reports began to trickle in of missing persons, Saurians who had vanished without a trace. Whispers of strange sightings of grotesque and mutated creatures lurking in the shadows spread like wildfire. Ramos, his instincts honed by years of combat, sensed that something was amiss. The missing persons, the unexplained sightings, it all pointed to a threat far more insidious than the approaching asteroid. He began to investigate, delving into the darkest corners of Saurian society. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. A group of Saurian scientists, led by the brilliant but eccentric geneticist Dr. Zorn, had been conducting secret experiments deep within the bowels of the city. Their goal had been to create a bioweapon capable of destroying the asteroid, a last-ditch effort to save their planet from annihilation. The experiments had resulted in the creation of a highly infectious mutagenic virus that transformed Saurians into feral, monstrous abominations. The virus, designated as the Zorn strain, had begun to spread through the population, causing widespread panic and chaos. Ramos knew that the virus posed an even greater threat to the Saurians than the asteroid. He quickly sought out Uko and his team, knowing that they were the only ones he could trust in this dire situation. "We need to contain this outbreak," Ramos said, his voice low and urgent. "If we don't, there won't be a planet left to save." Uko nodded, his eyes hardening with determination. "What do you need us to do?" Ramos laid out his plan. They would need to track down the infected Saurians and quarantine them, while also searching for a cure. It would be a dangerous mission, but one that they could not afford to fail. As they set out into the city, they found themselves faced with a new obstacle. Zahn and his faction, ever suspicious of Ramos and his intentions, had gotten wind of the outbreak. But instead of working to contain it, they saw the virus as a potential weapon to use against their enemies. Zahn's forces clashed with Ramos and Uko's team, hindering their efforts to contain the outbreak. The streets of the city became a battleground, with the infected Saurians caught in the middle. Amidst the chaos, Ramos received a disturbing message from Dr. Zorn himself. The geneticist, who had barricaded himself inside his laboratory, claimed to have found a way to control the infected Saurians and use them to stop the asteroid. "Join me, Ramos," Zorn urged, his voice crackling over the communicator. "Together we can save this planet and rule over a new, superior race of Saurians. With my intellect and your strength, we will be unstoppable." Ramos felt a chill run down his spine at Zorn's words. He had always distrusted the geneticist, sensing a darkness within him that belied his brilliance. But now, with the fate of the Saurian race hanging in the balance, he found himself torn. On one hand, Zorn's offer represented a chance to save the planet and end the crisis once and for all. But on the other, Ramos knew that the price of such power would be too high. He could not trust Zorn, not after seeing the horrors that his experiments had unleashed. As he stood there, the weight of the decision bearing down on him, Ramos knew that he had to act fast. The asteroid was approaching, and the virus was spreading. He had to find a way to stop both threats before it was too late. But which path would he choose? Would he join forces with the mad scientist, risking everything for a chance at ultimate power? Or would he find another way, one that did not involve sacrificing his principles and the lives of countless Saurians? The fate of an entire species hung in the balance, and Ramos knew that his next move would determine the course of history. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The clock was ticking, and time was running out. Ramos stared at the blinking communicator, Dr. Zorn's offer echoing in his mind. The temptation to end the crisis swiftly pulled at him, but a deeper instinct warned against trusting the geneticist's intentions. With a heavy sigh, Ramos crushed the device in his cybernetic hand. "Uko," he called out, his voice gruff with resolve. "We need to find a cure for this virus. Zorn's way isn't the answer." Uko nodded, his frills flaring with determination. "I might know where to start. The ancient ruins of my ancestors are said to hold lost medical knowledge. If there's a cure, it could be there." As they ventured into the crumbling ruins, an eerie silence enveloped them. The air grew thick with tension. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on dusty stone. "The virus?" Ramos muttered, his mechanical eye scanning their surroundings. "It's not just changing the infected, it's adapting, evolving, becoming harder to stop with each new host." A guttural growl shattered the stillness. From the shadows, twisted forms emerged, infected saurians, their bodies warped beyond recognition. At their head loomed a monstrous figure, its mottled scales stretched over bulging muscles. Uko gasped. "Counselor Zahn," he whispered, recognizing the creature's single malevolent eye. Ramos raised his plasma rifle, but the infected moved with unnatural speed. They swarmed the pair, claws and teeth flashing. In the chaos, Ramos felt a searing pain in his arm. He looked down to see a bite mark oozing with dark blood. The infected Zahn let out a triumphant roar before retreating with his minions into the depths of the ruins. Uko pulled Ramos to his feet. "We need to hurry," he urged, eyeing the bite with concern. "If the virus takes hold—" Ramos grimaced, the wound burning like fire. "Then let's hope your ancestors left us a clue." In the heart of the city, Dr. Zorn paced his laboratory, his eyes gleaming with feverish light. The containment tanks around him seethed with infected specimens, their forms twisting and mutating before his eyes. "More," Zorn muttered, his voice rasping. "I need more." He turned to the screens displaying the chaos engulfing the planet. His creations, once loyal servants, now ran rampant, spreading the virus with each new victim. But it wasn't enough. The asteroid hurtled closer, a death sentence for his world. Zorn's gaze fell on a pulsing canister, the modified virus swirling within. A smile stretched across his face, splitting the infected lesions that mottled his skin. "If they won't join me," he whispered, "then I'll make them." With shaking hands, he loaded the canister into the atmospheric dispersal system. One button, and the virus would blanket the planet, remaking the saurian race in his image. A hive mind, united in purpose, powerful enough to shatter the asteroid, powerful enough to rule the galaxy. Ramos and Uko, battered and bleeding, stumbled into a hidden chamber deep within the ruins. In the center, an ancient artifact pulsed with an otherworldly light. "This is it," Uko breathed, his eyes wide, "the key to stopping the virus." But as they approached, a chorus of shrieks filled the air. Zorn's minions poured into the chamber, their twisted forms blocking the exit. Ramos raised his rifle, the bite on his arm throbbing with each heartbeat. The virus coursed through his veins, promising power, promising release. He looked to Uko, saw the fear and determination in the young saurian's eyes. "Together," Ramos growled, as the infected closed in. "We end this together." The fate of the saurian race hung in the balance as Ramos and Uko prepared to make their final stand. Above them, the asteroid filled the sky, a looming harbinger of extinction. In the city, Zorn's finger hovered over the button, ready to unleash his final gambit. The countdown to oblivion had begun and time was running out. Ramos and Uko stared in awe as the ancient artifact pulsed with an otherworldly light. A holographic projection flickered to life, taking the form of a shimmering, translucent saurian. "I am Zix," the AI spoke, its voice resonating through the chamber. "I have watched and waited, hoping to guide my creator's descendants in their darkest hour. Ramos stepped forward, his mechanical eye whirring as it scanned the AI. You know about the asteroid, the virus? Zix nodded. I have analyzed the situation and determined the only viable course of action. The Zorn strain must be turned against itself, modified to target the infected and the asteroid while sparing the uninfected. Uko's frills flared with hope. Can it be done? Yes, Zix replied, but I require a sample of human genetic material to create the modified virus. Ramos, your blood contains the necessary components. Ramos grimaced as a wave of pain shot through his infected arm. He knew his time was running out. With a grunt, he extended his arm toward Zix. Take what you need. A thin, luminescent tendril extended from the AI, piercing Ramos's skin and drawing a sample of his blood. As Zix began to synthesize the modified virus, a sudden crash echoed through the chamber. Zorn's infected minions poured through the shattered doorway, their twisted forms filling the room. Ramos and Uko sprang into action, plasma rifle and neurotoxin darts flying as they fought to keep the horde at bay. The battle was fierce and brutal. Claws raked against flesh and teeth sank into scales. Ramos fought through the pain of his infection, his movements growing sluggish as the virus coursed through his veins. Beside him, Uko unleashed a barrage of toxin, his aim true even as his wounds bled freely. Just as the infected seemed to gain the upper hand, a blinding light filled the chamber. Zix had completed the modified virus, releasing it into the air in a shimmering cloud. The effect was instantaneous. The infected saurians began to convulse, their grotesque mutations receding as they reverted to their original forms. In the sky above, the asteroid shuddered as the virus penetrated its surface, causing it to crack and crumble. But amidst the chaos, one figure remained unchanged. Zorn, his body fully consumed by the virus, stood tall and defiant. His eyes blazed with madness as he fixed his gaze upon Ramos and Uko. Ramos raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. You're nothing but a monster, Zorn, a twisted abomination that needs to be put down. Zorn lunged forward, his claws outstretched. Ramos met him head-on, the two titans clashing in a whirlwind of blood and fury. They traded blows, each strike fueled by desperation and hatred. As Ramos and Zorn fought, Uko dragged himself to the chamber's control panel. His vision blurred and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he knew what had to be done. With trembling fingers, he began to upload Zix into the Saurian global network. Uko, Ramos shouted, dodging a swipe from Zorn's claws. What are you doing? The upload progress bar crept forward, each second an eternity. Zorn, realizing what was happening, let out a roar of rage. He threw Ramos aside and charged towards Uko, murder in his eyes. Ramos and Zorn battled viciously, their monstrous forms crashing against each other with brutal force. The chamber quaked and rumbled, ancient stone cracking as the structure began to give way under the strain of their titanic struggle. Across the room, Uko hunched over the control panel, his webbed fingers flying across the interface as he fought to upload Zix into the Saurian network. His breaths came ragged, blood seeping from his wounds, but he refused to yield. The fate of his world depended on his success. In the depths of cyberspace, Zix raced through the network, its presence spreading like a cleansing wave. But as it worked to eradicate the Zorn strain, the virus fought back with a malevolent will of its own. Zix's progress slowed, the AI encountering fierce resistance at every turn. Back in the physical realm, Ramos staggered under Zorn's relentless assault. The mutated scientist lashed out with claws and teeth, driven by a feral rage. Ramos's vision blurred, his strength waning as the infection ravaged his body. Ramos's flesh rippled and bulged, his bones cracking and reforming. Human and Saurian DNA interwove, creating a nightmarish hybrid. Scales erupted from his skin, his face elongating into a Saurian muzzle filled with razor fangs. Zorn recoiled, momentarily stunned by the grotesque transformation. That hesitation proved fatal. Ramos surged forward with blinding speed, his new form imbued with terrifying power. He slammed into Zorn, claws raking and jaws snapping. The two abominations grappled savagely, their blood splattering the crumbling walls. Ukko watched in horror, unable to tear his gaze away from the primal spectacle, even as his life drained away. Chunks of stone rained down, the chamber's collapse imminent. The very foundation of the ancient ruins shuddered, threatening to bury them all. Ramos and Zorn, lost to their bestial fury, paid no heed to the impending doom. In cyberspace, Zix redoubled its efforts, rallying against the Zorn strain's onslaught. The battle raged on, the fate of the Saurian race hanging by a thread. And amidst the chaos and destruction, Ukko slumped to the ground, his strength finally spent. As darkness claimed him, he could only pray that his sacrifice had not been in vain. In orbit, Admiral Nora Ivanova gripped the command console, her eyes fixed on the view screen displaying the chaos engulfing the Saurian homeworld. The asteroid loomed in the distance, an ominous harbinger of destruction, while the planet's surface seethed with the twisted forms of the infected. "The asteroid is still on a collision course, Admiral," the tactical officer replied, her fingers flying across the console. "Estimated impact in 2 hours." Ivanova's jaw clenched. They were running out of time. And the ground situation? "We've lost contact with Captain Ramos and his team. The last transmission indicated they were under attack by infected Saurians." The Admiral's eyes narrowed. She had served with Ramos for years, knew his strength and tenacity. If he was in trouble, the situation was dire indeed. "Dispatch a team of Marines to the surface," Ivanova ordered, her tone brooking no argument. "Equip them with our most advanced weapons and armor. Their mission is to locate and extract Captain Ramos and any survivors." As the crew rushed to carry out her commands, Ivanova turned to the communications officer. "Send a squadron of fighters to intercept the asteroid. They are to deploy all available ordnance to try and divert its course." The officer nodded, relaying the orders with crisp efficiency. Ivanova turned back to the view screen, her gaze hardening. They would not let this world fall, not while she still drew breath. On the surface, the marine dropship punched through the roiling clouds, its hull shuddering as it descended into the maelstrom. The soldiers inside checked their weapons, their faces grim beneath their helmets. Sergeant Mikhail Volkov, a grizzled veteran of countless battles, stood at the head of the squad. He had fought alongside Ramos in the past, knew the man's courage and skill. The thought of him falling to these abominations filled Volkov with a cold rage. As the dropship touched down, the Marines poured out, their boots crunching on the rubble-strewn ground. The ruins of the ancient Saurian city loomed before them, a twisted labyrinth of crumbling stone and shattered technology. And from the depths of that labyrinth, the infected emerged. They came in waves, a seething tide of mutated flesh and gnashing teeth. The Marines opened fire, their weapons spitting streams of plasma and razor-sharp shards of metal. The air filled with the stench of burning meat and the shrieks of the dying. But for every infected that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. They swarmed over the Marines, claws ripping and jaws snapping. Volkov watched in horror as his comrades fell, their screams echoing in his helmet. In cyberspace, Zix redoubled its efforts, the AI straining against the malevolent will of the Zorn strain. Streams of code clashed and intertwined, a battle as fierce as any physical confrontation. Slowly, painfully, Zix began to gain ground. The virus's hold on the Saurian network weakened, infected systems coming back online one by one. But the strain was immense, and Zix knew it could not keep up this pace forever. In the ruins, Ramos let out a roar of triumph as he ripped Zorn's head from his shoulders. The mutated Saurian's body toppled, twitching and spasming in its death throes. But even as the last of Zorn's life drained away, Ramos felt a new presence invading his mind. The Zorn strain, no longer tethered to its creator, surged through his mutated body, consuming his thoughts and twisting his will. Ramos turned, his eyes blazing with a feral light. He saw Ukko, saw the Marines fighting their way through the ruins. A low growl rumbled in his throat, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. Uko, his body battered and bleeding, looked up at the approaching monstrosity that had once been his friend. He saw no trace of Ramos in those eyes, no flicker of humanity behind that snarling visage. With a trembling hand, Uko reached for a fallen Marine's rifle. He raised the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered a final apology. The rifle bucked in his grip, the muzzle flash illuminating the ruins in a strobe of stark white light. Ramos staggered, a howl of pain and fury tearing from his throat. The wounds were not fatal, but they bought precious seconds. "Fall back!" Volkov shouted, his voice hoarse over the calm. "We can't hold them!" The Marines, those who still lived, began a fighting retreat, Volkov half carrying Uko as they fled the ruins. Behind them, the infected surged forward, Ramos at their head, his monstrous form consumed by an insatiable hunger. As the last of the Marines cleared the ruins, Volkov primed a jetpack, hurling the explosive deeper into the ancient structure. The blast shook the ground, sending tons of rubble crashing down in a choking cloud of dust and debris. The comm crackled, Ivanova's voice tense with concern. "Sergeant Volkov, report. What's your status?" Volkov looked back at the ruins, now a tomb for the fallen human and saurian alike. "We have Uko, Admiral, but Ramos, he didn't make it." On the bridge of the TSS Valiant, Admiral Ivanova's eyes narrowed as the fighter squadron raced towards the looming asteroid. The pilots, their faces grim with determination, armed their thermonuclear warheads, preparing to deliver a devastating blow to the space rock that threatened the saurian homeworld. But as the fighters closed in, their sensors began to scream with warnings. The asteroid's surface, once a lifeless expanse of rock and ice, now pulsed with a sickening organic vitality. Tendrils of infected matter, pulsing with the Zorn strain's corrupting influence, lashed out at the approaching ships. The pilots, caught off guard by the asteroid's sudden transformation, struggled to evade the writhing tentacles. Plasma fire and missiles streaked through the void, but the asteroid's defenses seemed to absorb the attacks, growing stronger with each blast. One by one, the fighters fell. Some were crushed by the asteroid's tendrils, their hulls crumpling like tin cans. Others were dragged into the asteroid's surface, their pilots' screams cut short as the Zorn strain consumed them. On the Valiant's viewscreen, Ivanova watched in horror as the asteroid's surface seethed with the infected saurians' genetic material. The virus had spread beyond the planet, beyond the saurians themselves. It had become something new, something monstrous. "All ships, fall back," Ivanova barked, her voice cutting through the chaos on the bridge. "Initiate full-scale evacuation of the saurian homeworld. We can't stop that thing with conventional weapons." As the fleet began to pull away from the asteroid, Ivanova turned to her tactical officer. "Prepare the Sunhammer. That abomination has to be destroyed, no matter the cost." On the surface, Uko raced through the streets of the saurian capital, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. Around him, the city was in chaos, with saurians of all ages and castes desperately trying to reach the evacuation sites. The Marines, their armor battered and stained with the blood of the infected, formed a cordon around the fleeing civilians. They fought with grim determination, their weapons blazing as they held back the hordes of mutated saurians that pressed in from all sides. In cyberspace, Zix raced through the saurian network, its digital form a blur of light and code. The AI had gained control of most of the planet's systems, but it could sense the Zorn strain's presence, a malevolent force that sought to corrupt and consume everything in its path. As Zix probed deeper into the network, it discovered a terrifying truth. The Zorn strain, in a final act of desperation, had begun to merge with the asteroid's core. The virus was creating a singularity, a point of infinite density and gravity that threatened to consume not just the saurian system, but the entire galaxy. Zix knew that its processing power alone was not enough to stop the singularity. The AI began to search for a way to enhance its capabilities, scouring the network for any scrap of data that could help. As the evacuation neared completion and the Sunhammer's energy levels climbed towards critical mass, a figure emerged from the ruins of the Saurian capital. It was Ramos, his body battered and bloody, but his eyes gleaming with a newfound power. The hybrid creature, a fusion of human and Saurian DNA, stumbled towards the evacuation site, its intentions unclear. The Marines, already stretched to their limits, raised their weapons, unsure whether to fire or flee. Ramos, his voice a guttural rasp, called out to Uko. "I can help," he said, his words slurred by his misshapen jaw. "I can stop the Zorn strain, but I need your help." Uko, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, hesitated. He had seen what Ramos had become, the monster that lurked beneath his friend's twisted flesh. But he also knew that time was running out, and that every option, no matter how desperate, had to be considered. As Uko stepped forward to meet Ramos, the Sunhammer's countdown reached 0. As the Sunhammer's countdown reached 0, Ramos emerged from the ruins, his hybrid form battered but unbroken. Marines leveled their rifles at the approaching monstrosity, fingers tense on triggers. "Hold your fire," Uko rasped. "That's Ramos." Uko stared at his transformed friend, disbelief and hope warring in his chest. Around them the evacuation continued, desperate Saurians rushing to Terran shuttles as the world crumbled. "I've been talking to Zix," Ramos continued. "My hybrid DNA could give it the power boost it needs to stop this." "How?" Uko asked, frills flaring with tension. "By merging with it, becoming one. Here's the only way." The hybrid set his jaw with grim determination. "This is bigger than me, bigger than any of us. I have to do this." To get to the central network hub, Zix is waiting. Uko turned to the Marines. "You heard him. We're going to that hub." They set off at a brutal pace, Ramos loping ahead with preternatural speed. The streets seethed with infected, their twisted forms lurching from shadows. Plasma fire lit the twilight as the Marines fought to clear a path. At the hub's entrance, a wave of abominations surged forth, screeching with mindless hunger. Tooth and claw met steel and plasma, the air thick with the stench of seared flesh. Ramos vanished into the complex, the horde swarming in his wake. Uko and the Marines fought with desperate savagery, but the tide was relentless. One by one the soldiers fell, torn apart by flailing limbs and snapping jaws. Inside, Ramos raced through pulsing corridors towards Zix's chamber. The walls shuddered, alive with the Zorn strain's rage. He burst into the sanctum to find Zix's avatar waiting, a shimmering figure of light. "Quickly," Zix urged. "The merge must begin now." Ramos stepped into the swirling vortex of code, feeling his flesh start to unravel. Agony lanced through every nerve as the hybridization process began anew, fusing meat and machine, DNA and data. Outside, Uko stood alone against the horde, neurotoxin spent, plasma rifle slagged to molten slag. Claws raked his scales, fangs pierced his flesh, but still he fought, buying precious seconds with his life. From high orbit, the Sunhammer fired, a lance of pure energy hurling towards the planetary surface. It struck the infected singularity like the fist of an angry god, the detonation outshining the system's stars. The Saurian homeworld convulsed in its death throes, continents cracking, oceans boiling. The shockwave scoured the surface of city and jungle alike, leaving only bedrock behind. In the shattered network hub, a new being rose from the ashes. Not quite Ramos, not quite Zix, but something more, something transcendent. The merged entity looked upon the devastation with ancient, all-seeing eyes. There would be a reckoning for this apocalypse. Aboard the Terran evacuation ships, the last Saurians huddled in grief and disbelief. Their world, their civilization, reduced to ash and echoes. Uko's body rested in a makeshift shrine, hailed as the savior of a lost race. As the fleet set course for Terran space, a single thought flickered through the survivors' minds. What price survival? The proud Saurian species now bound in eternal debt to the mammals they once dismissed as primitives. The future stretched ahead, bleak and uncertain. The Terran fleet drifted through the void, a solemn procession of battered ships carrying the last remnants of a shattered civilization. In the bowels of the vessels, the Saurian refugees huddled together, their eyes haunted by the memories of their lost homeworld and the horrors they had endured. But even as they fled, a new nightmare was brewing within the very ships that had saved them. It started with a scream, a sound that echoed through the cramped corridors and sent chills down the spines of all who heard it. A Terran crewman, his body twisted and deformed, emerged from the shadows, his eyes blazing with an unholy hunger. The Zorn strain, thought to have been eradicated, had found a new host. Panic swept through the fleet as more and more Terrans fell victim to the virus, their bodies warping into grotesque parodies of their former selves. The infected, driven by a primal urge to spread their corruption, turned on their own, tearing through the ships with a savage fury. Uko, his scales still stained with the blood of his fallen comrades, found himself thrust into a leadership role once more. He worked tirelessly with Admiral Ivanova to contain the outbreak, sealing off entire sections of the ships and desperately trying to find a way to stop the Zorn strain. But the virus had evolved, becoming more powerful and resilient than ever before. It seemed to anticipate their every move, staying one step ahead of their efforts to contain it. As the days turned into weeks, the situation grew more and more dire. The infected Terrans, their numbers growing with each passing hour, began to organize under the leadership of a twisted, mutated version of Ramos himself. The creature that had once been Ramos, its body a nightmarish fusion of human and Saurian DNA, stalked the corridors of the ships, hunting down the remaining survivors with a relentless determination. Its eyes, once filled with the light of intelligence and compassion, now glowed with a feral predatory hunger. Uko and Ivanova, their options dwindling, made a desperate discovery. The key to stopping the Zorn strain lay within the remnants of Zix, the AI that had sacrificed itself to destroy the Singularity. But accessing that information would be a daunting task. The infected Terrans, led by the twisted Ramos, seemed to sense the threat to their existence and redoubled their efforts to eliminate the survivors. Uko, his body battered and his spirit weary, steeled himself for one final stand. He knew that the fate of his people, and perhaps the entire galaxy, rested on his shoulders. Together with Ivanova and a handful of brave Saurian and Terran volunteers, Uko fought his way through the infested ships, battling the infected hordes with a grim determination. Every step was a struggle, every moment a battle for survival. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of blood and horror, they reached the core of the Terran fleet, where the remnants of Zix lay hidden. Ivanova, her face lined with exhaustion and grim resolve, worked feverishly to isolate a sample of the AI's code, praying that it would hold the key to their salvation. But even as they labored, the infected closed in, led by the monstrous Ramos. The creature, its body a mass of twisted flesh and razor-sharp claws, lunged at Uko with a roar of primal fury. The two titans clashed in a whirlwind of blood and violence, their struggle a microcosm of the larger battle that raged around them. Uko fought with the strength of desperation, his every blow fueled by the memory of his fallen comrades and the weight of his people's fate. And then, just as all seemed lost, Ivanova let out a triumphant cry. She had done it, isolated the key to defeating the Zorn strain. With trembling hands, she uploaded the code into the fleet's main computer, praying that it would be enough. For a moment, nothing happened. The infected Terrans, their eyes blazing with unholy hunger, pressed in from all sides, their claws and teeth seeking the flesh of the survivors. And then, like a wave of cleansing fire, the countermeasure swept through the fleet. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.